Hello, everybody. Good evening, and we're so glad that you have joined us for this forum from the League of Women Voters, also sponsored by the Columbia Public Library. And we have several people who are scheduled to be joining us tonight, and we're so glad that you are, although we're also a little bit disappointed that we can't be in the Friends Room like we usually are for these forums and be able to see you face to face and have our panelists there in person. But I think we're going to have a good evening, a good hour as we talk about the issues that are going to be on the ballot. I wonder if some of you might have already voted. If you did, then you probably did your homework on Amendment 1 and 3, and maybe you're just here to flesh out some more information about it and help others understand them. If that's the situation, great. Maybe most of us, if not all of us, are still to be educated about Amendment 1 and Amendment 3. We do have an opportunity tonight to respond to your questions. We do have the chat enabled, and as you watch tonight, if you see the presentations from Amendment 1 or Amendment 3 and you have a question that you do not know whether we'll get to or you haven't heard it asked yet, then add that to the chat. We'll try our best to get as many questions as we can from those of you who are participating that way. You won't be able to see all of the messages that come from the rest of the participants, but all of those of us who are involved in this forum will be able to see those. Again, we do thank the League of Women Voters for always coordinating these events. They do have several more that are coming up. Next week, there will be a couple. October the 6th, they'll be doing one of these Zoom panels with the state representatives. October 13th, they're going to be featuring the Boone County Commissioners. And then October 14th, there will be the Boone County Sheriff and a Circuit Judge. So check the website for League of Women Voters or the website, just do a search and you'll be able to see what's going to be presented through this way with the future forums. Tonight, again, we're focusing on the amendments, and amendment number 1 ballot language is, do you want to amend the Missouri Constitution to extend the 2-term restriction that currently applies to the governor, to the treasurer, to the lieutenant governor, secretary of state, auditor, and the attorney general? We're going to get background on these and talking about those term limits and why you should or why you should vote against this amendment. And it really is a privilege to be able to welcome to help us to go through the pros and cons of this amendment in the background, a former judge, former state representative, and someone who has held many positions and dear to the hearts of those of us who have been around this community for a long time, Chris Kelly. Chris, it is good to see you and welcome you to tell us what you can to help us understand Amendment number 1. Good evening.
Well, David, I'm glad to be here. And for 40 years, I've been coming to and witnessing the League of Women Voters forums, and they're a real public service and also a public service by the Columbia Public Library. Daniel Boone Regional Library. Amendment number 1 extends term limits to the governor, the state treasurer, the lieutenant governor, and the secretary of state, and the state auditor. That means that no one is able to serve, if it passes, no one would be able to serve more than 2 terms in those offices. And also, anyone who has served more than 2 years of a previous term, that would count as one of your 2 terms. The language specifically provides that right now the Missouri governor rose to that office because the old governor, the previous governor, vacated. The lieutenant governor moved up to governor, and there was a new appointed state treasurer because the person who was state treasurer was appointed to the office of attorney general. So now we have the only person in the statewide offices in Missouri who was elected to fill the office that they currently hold is the Secretary of State. And the language specifically provides that the time that these appointed people spent in those offices applies toward the measurement for this ballot measure. But I can't remember off the top of my head if Governor Parson or Lieutenant Governor Keogh or Treasurer Fitzpatrick will have been in any of those offices for more than 2 years. there's another interesting question of, is there an ex post facto problem? Can they pass a constitutional amendment that limits the rights of somebody already in the office? If I were supporting this amendment, I would say that term limits is generally a good governmental behavior. It tends to get rid of old, stale people and old, stale ideas, gives new people a chance, brings new ideas in, promotes the value that comes from new ideas and energetic young people, or newer people at least. If I were opposed to it, I would say that experience has taught us that term limits, although an interesting promise, hasn't fulfilled. That what's often happened is we've gotten people who are less knowledgeable about the government, less knowledgeable about their offices, and more prone to outside influence because of their lack of knowledge. Those would generally be the arguments that I would make. Now, to make sure any bias that I have is fully disclosed, I am against term limits generally. I don't think these are as harmful as the term limits on the legislature, because it doesn't really matter if the state treasurer is term limited or not. It would for the governor, and it does for the attorney general. The other thing is, nobody's ever made an argument that it's broken. There's a reasonable argument that I don't ultimately accept for the legislature that it was broken, but no one can find an example of a person in statewide office that was served a long time and thereby disserved the people. It's only really two people in living memory who served more than 2 years, I think. Jay Nixon as Attorney General and Jim Kirkpatrick as State Treasurer or State Secretary of State. And in both those positions, I think the citizens widely regarded them as effective office holders. So there is, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, is a reasonably good argument. At least I believe so after my 40 years in Missouri and state and county government. I'd be happy to entertain any questions.
All right, I have some questions, and again, participants, if you would like to join us through the chat, I'll be scanning those questions also. So what is other state practices on this? And I mean the states around us or elsewhere, do they have the similar setup that we have in Missouri now?
There's a wide variety. This would be among the more draconian term limits. Many states, some states have none. Most states have a term limit for governor, and most states are like us, a 2-term limit for governor. Some states say that you can't serve more than 8 years in every 12, so that you have to go away for at least some period of time. Missouri limits are lifetime. But I think you can go to Ballotpedia and they will tell you all the states and what they are, but there's a tremendous variety. Some states like us term limit some of the officers, but not others. Some don't term limit any, and some term limit them all.
How clear is this amendment? I want to go back to something that you said right off the bat, and that is that, for example, somebody has pointed out on our chat that Nicole Galloway was elected the most recent election for state auditor. So she came in fulfilling a term, but she has been elected now for a full term. Is this amendment clear? If it passed, let's say she loses the race for governor, would she be able to run for auditor again?
I think no. And I think that might have been part of the political motivation for having put it on the ballot. Because she became auditor in 2015, which means that she served in the current, or she did serve in the appointed term for more than, no, I'm wrong. She was appointed in 15 and won in 16, didn't she? So I think that would not count. I think I'm wrong about that now that I think it through, because she's not in an appointed term now. She's at the end, she's in the middle of her first elected term, and she was 1 year in office in her appointed term. So I think Auditor Galloway could probably run again, as could, I believe, all of the Republican appointed office holders. The governor technically wasn't appointed, was he? He rose to the position because he was lieutenant governor when Governor Greitens went away.
Somebody has wanted to know this, and I wanted to know the same answer to the question. What was the motivation for this? Who was behind this and said, let's get this done?
Queen Elizabeth said, "I will not make windows into men's minds." I don't know the motivation of any individual supporter or legislator who supported it. But generally speaking, there are people who legitimately believe that it's good to get people out of government. I had an interesting and perhaps unique experience in that I served in both a term limited and a non-term limited legislature. And when I went in the second time, I resolved to try to keep an open mind. And trying at least to have done so, I think that everything that people say that's wrong with term limits is, and there's another important consideration. In the bad old days, before term limits, legislators on either party would never listen to their political party, about any issue of public policy. We would have caucuses twice a year. Now they have caucuses twice a week. And the caucus, or the political party, tells legislators how to vote. My gosh, Dick Webster, I think a famous Republican senator, would have laughed in the face of any Republican party who told him how to vote, as would Roger Wilson or myself or any number of Democratic and Republican legislators. Now, however, the legislators don't know about the issues, and the parties are never interested in the public policy, both of them. They're interested only in the short-term political gains that will arise from any given piece of legislation. So their advice on how to vote will always be at the most crass political level rather than any public policy level.
This is something we have tonight that they didn't have last night during the presidential debate. We have fact checkers. Nicole Galloway was elected in 2018, according to several of our participants, and so she did run just a couple of years ago. I would say this, though, I think I think it'll be interesting to see how people feel on this particular amendment, because what you just described with state legislators, be they senators or representatives, I think makes sense, the institutional knowledge. But you've also pointed out that on the level of a state office holder that is not at this point in time restricted to 2 terms, there are a few instances where somebody ensconces themselves in there and wants to stay there for a long time rather than to move on to another position.
That's correct. You know, Dave Luthold made the point about her being elected in 18, and then I returned to not being wrong, because if she served 16, 17, and 18 as auditor in her first term, then she may well be precluded from getting elected. So I'm back to my original belief that the amendment has some short-term political motivation.
Right. And
us older people often do.
We talked before that she might be grandmothered in or not grandmothered in. In other words, that's passed.
Bill McKenna wasn't. Bill McKenna was a state senator who was elected to a partial term of only 1 year, and then was elected and served for an entire 4-year term. But after 5 years in the Senate, had to retire because of term limits. So if the McKenna case is analogous here, then Galloway could not run for an additional term.
This is also clear, and a few people were wanting to know this on their questions, and that is that you could run and serve 2 terms as state auditor and then run for Secretary of State or governor. This is per office, not per person.
That's correct. That's correct.
Let's see, somebody says, how would this have impacted John Ashcroft, who was both state attorney general and governor? I think we've just answered that. And as one person has pointed out, now it depends if one has served half or more of a partial term, whether that counts in the term limits as to what you can serve overall.
Clearly does. The specific language does include more than 2 years. Let's talk about Ashcroft for a moment. Ashcroft is one of 5 two-term excellent governors that have served the state of Missouri. If you think Hearns, Bond, Ashcroft, Carnahan, and Nixon, all of whom you can disagree with all of them for many, many different reasons, but they were all really good governors. And part of the reason they were such good governors was because they knew a lot about the government of the state of Missouri. I think that is relevant to one's analysis of the value of term limits.
Let me ask you this, based on your experience, when people go and pick up an absentee or a mail-in ballot or vote in person on November the 3rd, how do you think this is going to turn out? What do you think is going to attract people? Any guess as to what? Because I'll be honest with you, I think there are many people, if we went out on the street tomorrow and started asking people, tell me what you think about Amendment 1, we would get a blank stare from a lot of people that are on the street.
No one knows it's there, and I believe it'll pass.
I'll give people just a final chance here. Somebody has asked, didn't there used to be a 1-term limit on Missouri governors prior to Kit Bond?
1 consecutive term. I think Forrest served 2 terms with an intervening term. Well, as did Bond. Bond was elected, lost, and came back and won again. But there used to be a rule that you could only be governor for 4 years in a row for 1 term. And that changed. Hearns was the first 2-year consecutive governor. There were at least 1 and maybe more governors prior to that who had served a term, was out, and then came back and served another term.
That seems weird. I didn't realize that. I mean, to serve 4 years and then know that you're going to have to vacate that position, I think at least 2 terms makes a lot of sense, especially wanting some experience.
Yeah. Well, look at the practical impact. It's awful hard to make an argument that Hearns, Ashcroft, Bond, Nixon, and Carnahan were not all crackerjack governors.
I guess the flip side of that is, though, if you elect someone who knows I have 1 term, that person is not running for re-election immediately upon being voted into that position.
That's an excellent point. And it's very, very true in the 2-year analysis of the Missouri House of Representatives. Well, in the Congress, too.
Let's see. We're going to thank you for your time in a moment, Chris Kelly, but let me finish up. I'm looking at the chats right now, and a comment. One might say that the impetus for putting Amendment 1 on the ballot was to assume people will vote for it and therefore also vote for Amendment 3.
That's a leap, in my opinion. But you know what else there is? There's a lot of fall off. By the time you get down to it, there's natural fall off, which I deplore, but such is life, as you go down the ballot. Everybody who picks up a ballot almost will vote in the presidential election. By the time you get to county commissioners, you may have a fall off of 12 or 13%. And it's even greater as you get down to the propositions.
You want to say, all right, somebody wants to clarify, and so we'll do this as a wrap-up. We asked for 15 minutes of your time, and you've been very generous with that and have given us this clarification. What does it mean if you vote yes on Amendment 1 or no on Amendment 1?
Good question. A yes on Amendment 1 will mean that there are term limits imposed on the offices that we talked about. That is Attorney General, Secretary of State, Lieutenant Governor, State Auditor, and State Treasurer. There is already a 2-term limit on the governor and the
treasurer.
Governor.
Treasurer.
Treasurer. That's right. Treasurer.
So again, final question: if Nicole Galloway,
yes means yes, by the way, here.
I'm
yes
sorry.
Means the term limit goes on.
Right. Yes means that you would be term limited in those additional state-held offices
Yeah.
like the governor and the treasurer are now. So a yes means you are for term limiting the lieutenant governor, the secretary of state, the auditor, and the attorney general.
That's right.
No means I like it the way it is now, don't touch it.
It ain't broke, don't fix it.
If Galloway loses the governor race and she wants to run for the auditor position again after this term that she was elected to 2 years ago, she can or cannot run
I
again.
think she cannot.
Okay. Chris Kelly, thank you. Always appreciate your expertise and the knowledge you bring about how the state is doing its business and running. Have a good evening. Thank you. Look to see you. Let's move on then. And Chris Kelly, who has helped us with amendment number 1. Of course, amendment number 2 is where a whole lot of attention, amendment 3 is where a whole lot of attention has been put. And we're going to welcome those who are on both sides. We have one speaker for and one speaker against amendment number 3. And we're going to introduce those and let them have 10 minutes to present their side, and then we'll engage them in questions. So I'll be holding off on questions for the first presentations for both of our guests. Let me read the second ballot issue, amendment number 3. The ballot is worded this way: shall the Missouri Constitution be amended to ban gifts from paid lobbyists to legislators and their employees, reduce legislative campaign contribution limits, change the redistricting process voters approved in 2018 by 1, transferring responsibility for drawing state legislative districts from the nonpartisan state demographer to the governor appointed by partisan commissions, and 2, modifying and reordering the redistricting criteria. Our speaker for the pro side of amendment number 3 is Tina Goodrick, and she's joining us from the St. Joseph area. She is the founder of the Northwest Missouri Political Action Committee and is a supporter of amendment number 3. And so we'll welcome Tina Goodrick to the program. I think everything goes smoothly here. I'm not sure whether I'm supposed to click anything else or not, and see her opening comments about why we should support amendment number 3. Tina Goodrick, welcome this evening. Thank you for joining us and taking over.
Well, thank you for having me. It was kind of spur of the moment here, but I appreciate it. I ran for state representative earlier in the primary and didn't make it through that, and just wanted to make sure I was helpful in the government in some way. So created a Northwest Missouri Conservative PAC. And when I saw the Amendment 3, I thought that was very important. So have taken that on and tried to get information out to the public before it's time to vote. Amendment 3. Well, in 2018, we had Amendment 1 on the ballot, and it claimed to be ethics reform for the state legislator. It was called Clean Missouri, and it reduced the size of lobbyist gifts to legislative candidates. It reduced campaign contribution limits and prevented a legislator from becoming a lobbyist for 2 years. I am fine with all that. But then it had the important language adopting new rules for redrawing districts. No other states do this. I believe that was the prime motive of the people who sponsored it. Right now, we have redistricting rules that make sure we have compact and contiguous areas for state representatives and Senate districts. Anyway, the important thing is the important thing in Amendment 1 was that they wanted to make sure there was competitiveness in the House and Senate and they wanted to make sure that Republican and Democrat proportions were 50-50. Of course, some of our districts are very far off from that. The district that I'm in is much more Republican than Democrat. So you could see the lines from my area, which is very rural, being drawn in to Kansas City in order to make it equal. I see a future with this not getting passed, having our legislators not be from the area where we live, but clear over in Kansas City and whatnot. It will be drawn way out, far away from our district, and it won't the people who will be representing us don't have any idea what we need for our district. And really that can be said for Kansas City areas. How are they going to feel if they're drawn in with the farmland? I just don't feel like our legislators will be able to represent the people very well if they do not know the people in their areas. So we are going with Amendment 3, it'll ban lobbyist gifts, it'll restore bipartisan redistricting commissions. Right now, as it is, we would have the one state auditor in charge of picking out one person that will decide how our districts are redrawn. What we are saying is we need a bipartisan commission, so equal Democrats, equal Republicans, so 10 Democrats, 10 Republicans, and they will draw the districts, compare them, try to agree, and if they can't, then judges come in and they help get it drawn. So we have many people working on it together, which is a much better idea than one single person picking whoever they happen to love and saying this one person gets to draw the lines that are only drawn once every 10 years after our census is done. So we're just having our census done right now, and that will be the basis for drawing our lines. Any questions?
I think we'll have some questions, and we'll go to those, and we'll welcome you back to talk about those in a few moments. I appreciate your
Is my video
introduction
off? There we go.
and presenting it to us now. And stand by. We're going to go to the opposition for amendment number 3 and let him have his opening presentation, and then we'll come back and we'll engage in questions for both of you. The speaker who would say vote no on amendment 3 is Sean Nicholson, and he is from Clean, Missouri. He joins us now, I would guess, from the Kansas City area. And Sean, it's good to talk to you. Tell us the opposition's point of view, the no vote on amendment 3.
Yeah, thank you, David. It's so good to see some familiar names in the attendee list. We're here because, as Tina mentioned, we worked for a long time in 2017 and 2018 to pass nonpartisan redistricting reforms. Those reforms, the Clean Missouri Amendment, passed with an overwhelming bipartisan majority, a bipartisan mandate in 2018 in Boone County in the 19th Senate District, for instance. The Clean Missouri Amendment passed 70-30 statewide. It passed by an almost 2-to-1 margin. I am in Kansas City now, but Columbia was home for a long time and hope that it is home again before too long. So thanks so much for having me, and I'm excited to talk through what is in the fine print of Amendment 3. So Amendment 3 is fundamentally, at the end of the day, about having a redistricting system where lobbyists and political operatives can draw lines to protect their favorite incumbents in super safe districts where they don't have to be held, or where they can't be held accountable by the voters back home. The folks who are behind Amendment 3, the politicians and lobbyists who put it together, know you won't like what's in the fine print. So it is crafted to trick voters and to deceive you into thinking that it's something that it's not. And so I'm going to walk through a little bit of that deception and get into some of the fine print. And with the questions that are coming in, I'm excited to have a conversation about what's going on here and what's really at stake, because it really is very important to how our families, how our communities are represented. So Amendment 3 is designed to trick you. And the tricks are actually not that complicated. One, they have a $5 change to lobbyist gift limits with exemptions for some lobbyists. And then they've got a $100 change to campaign contribution limits for state Senate candidates only. That is the sum total of everything in Amendment 3 that is not about redistricting. Amendment 3 is so deceptive. When it was sent to the ballot by politicians, the folks who crafted it, who wrote the language, tried to get their own ballot language, what you are going to see on the ballot. They wrote their own language, what they hoped would appear. And two separate courts ruled that the politicians behind Amendment 3 broke the law with their lies about what's in the fine print. You may have seen, you probably saw that ruling in Cole County, and then there was a ruling at the Court of Appeals where both courts affirmed that what politicians had written was deceptive and dishonest. And then the Cole County Court rewrote the language, and then the Western District said, let's not go as far as the Cole County person said, and so they rewrote it again. And so what you're going to see on the ballot is what was rewritten by the Western District Court of Appeals. But the big takeaway, the net of all this, is that they broke the law and what they wanted you to see on the ballot. It is still, as Dave read, it's still a little bit confusing. And so I'm happy, I'm excited to be a part of a campaign that is helping voters understand what's really going on. So one thing that is super important to understand is that Amendment 3 is not an attempt to return us to the system that existed in 2011 or 2001. It has a lot of the things that you might expect in a gerrymandering plan. They want more secrecy. They want to make the map drawing body more partisan than it's ever been. Commissions have existed in Missouri in the past. The Clean Missouri Amendment didn't change those commissions at all. They still exist, but Amendment 3 would make them bigger, would centralize control and give the state parties, the state Democratic Party and the state Republican Party, more power for picking who's in the back rooms drawing maps. It has new loopholes and ways for communities to get carved up. It weakens protections for communities of color. It objectively weakens the legal protections for voters of color, which is a big deal and really problematic. And it has new loopholes to allow gerrymandering, so that all together, all these rules combined, the end result would be politician protection maps. So those are all the bag of things that everyone expects to be in a bad gerrymandering plan. But there are three brand new things in Amendment 3 that are unlike anything else Missouri has ever seen and unlike anything in the country. One, they don't even want to count everyone in the maps. They want to change who counts in the maps by changing the population base in very profound ways that I'm going to talk through here in a second. Two, they want to flip the voter approved rules requiring an overall fair plan. They want to flip that on its head to actually explicitly allow the most extreme gerrymander, mathematically speaking, in the entire United States for state legislative plans. And then the third thing that they want to do that's unlike anything anywhere is they want to make it so judges can't even throw out plans, full map plans, even if the judge finds that they're unconstitutional. So on the who counts, because I know this is where folks have got some questions, and this impacts what you're going to see on the fiscal note for Amendment 3, and I'm going to show you that fiscal note here in a second. So right now, Missouri is like every other state in the United States. After the census is done, we take everyone who's in our state, the 6.1 million of us, and we divide that by the number of districts, and that's how you get the ideal population of every district. Missouri has been doing this since at least 1875, 145 years. We've been counting everyone when we draw the maps. Every other state does this now. This is a fundamental tenet of good, fair maps, of good democracy. The explicit goal of Amendment 3, this is confirmed on the record by the sponsor and by the Attorney General's office during the lawsuit. They want to cut citizens and non-citizen, they want to cut kids and non-citizen immigrants out of the population so that they don't count. They want to draw maps just on the number of eligible voters in the state. That may not sound like a big deal at first, but when you look at the numbers, it's a very, very big deal. So if you draw maps based on just the number of eligible voters, that's 4.6 million Missourians. Almost all of them are kids. So 2% of Missouri's population are non-citizen immigrants, regardless of status. 23%, 1 in 4 almost, of Missourians are not eligible to vote just because they happen to not be 18 yet. So 2 of them are upstairs. I can hear one of them yelling. The other one is taking a bath right now. So they don't count. They wouldn't be represented in the maps. This is wrong on its face. It also happens to be discriminatory in its impact because Black and brown communities, Asian communities are relatively younger than their white counterparts. This is a known feature of what would happen if you draw maps this way. One of the proponents of this wrote a memo about it a couple years ago, and the numbers in Missouri back that up. So if you don't count kids in our maps, the deal on the table, what would happen is 1 in 5 white Missourians would not count, and then 1 in 4 Black Missourians wouldn't count, and then half of the Latino and the Asian communities would not count just because they aren't eligible to vote. If you do this, if this happens, representation in the legislature would be profoundly impacted because your neighborhood, your families, your communities would be underrepresented. And the research backs up common sense that if your community isn't fully counted, if your neighborhood, if your family isn't fully counted, you don't get the same fair share of the representation and the resources. Like, the research backs up the common sense. And so that's why what you'll see on the ballot is that local governments expect significant decreased revenues if Amendment 3 passes because of the dramatic way this seemingly subtle shift in policy would impact representation and who counts and who matters in the state capitol. Because of this, because of all of the radical details that I've been talking through, and because of the huge bipartisan mandate that some of you helped deliver back in 2018 for fair redistricting and fair maps, we have got a bigger coalition in 2020 than we had back in 2018, then we were saying yes to a fair map system. Now we're saying no to a gerrymandered plan. We're saying no on 3. And so you've got everyone from former United States Senator Jack Danforth talking about Amendment 3 being a redistricting scheme more extreme than Missouri has ever seen. You have leaders from St. Louis and Kansas City talking about the discriminatory impact of this proposal. This is really an issue, a question on which Missourians across the political spectrum, from small towns where I grew up, to big cities where I live now, to the suburbs, can all come together and say, this is a really bad, flawed idea, and it's not the kind of thing that we need Missouri to have. So with that, I will pause and kick it back to David for some questions.
All right, appreciate it, Sean. We're going to go to questions and we'll get caught up on some of your chat questions, but I want to ask some questions, first of all, that the League of Women Voters have provided me, and then also some of the questions that come up from what we've heard. I want to go back to our first speaker on this issue, Tina Goodrich. Address the issue that Sean was hitting pretty hard in regard to counting everyone, or the one person, one vote, I think is somehow how that is also categorized. But address that from the point of view of those who are supporting Amendment 3, why it would make sense to say, let's just count those who are adult age, not the children, not the non-citizens.
It only makes sense to just have the voters included. I mean, there's no sense in including people that can't vote. It seems pretty plain and clear to me. Voters are the ones that need to be included when you're districting, doing the redistricting.
Some would say the services, though, are provided for all within a certain district, though.
People who are voting are the ones that are going to be making the decisions, though.
Let's make it clear right now, and I'll ask you, since you're on the camera with us again, Ms. Goodrich. Somebody, I think, through the chat, and I was glancing through this a few moments ago, it went away when Sean was making his presentation. So those of you who were chatting, I need to get caught up. We're talking about the way to draw the district lines for what offices. There is some confusion I can see by some of the chat. This group that would be impacted, either a bipartisan commission or the demographer, they are drawing, based on the census, the lines for what voting entities? State
So
rep.
this applies only to the state legislature. So in the voter approved rules, the demographer draws draft plans, and then those draft plans for the state house districts, for the state senate districts, are then turned over to the commissions that still exist now. They existed before, continue to exist. The other key thing that happens when those are turned over is the demographer makes all the data public that was used, and that will be in 2021, that will be the first time that Missouri has ever had such a thing, a shared public data set. So we can all see what happened. We can all look at the data and see, oh, this is why these districts are drawn this way. Here's a better way that the commissions can modify it. But you're right, David, this applies only to the House and Senate districts, not to the congressional map.
Because somebody had sent in a question saying something about Vicki Hartzler's area that she represents, which does lead me then to a question for you, Sean. A lot of people complain about the way that the Hartzler's congressional district for the U.S. House of Representatives is drawn. Why would we want to see the same thing then for our Missouri state representative districts?
Yeah, so our congressional plans are drawn by politicians to protect the political interests of folks in Congress. So it is a political system to create incumbent protection maps. It is not an accident that one district that might be competitive in a year, the rest are all super decided when filing closes. So Amendment 3 tries to get at that same outcome through a different mechanism, through a different process. But the end goal is the same, to have super incumbent protection districts where voters don't really have a functional choice in who represents them in the Capitol.
I'll ask you this, and if Tina Goodrich wants to respond to any of these things, I want to include her on this. But what she was saying about rural areas, and I grew up in a rural area of Missouri, and I don't know how you find partisan fairness within some of the areas of Missouri that are so strongly at this point in time Republican. And if you put in the factor of race, I don't know how you come up with a fair district unless you do some very weird map drawing.
Yeah, so the way the rules are written in the voter approved rules, protecting the voting power of communities of color comes first. So you're totally right about that. That comes first. And then the rules for partisan fairness and competitiveness apply to the overall plan. They don't apply to a specific district. They don't prescribe, hey, one district needs to look this way or that way. They say the overall plan cannot be unfair to one party or the other. And in fact, there's been a lot of analysis done of this. I will drop a link in the chat. There's a really great research project done by the Princeton Gerrymandering Project, which is an academic outfit, mathematicians, demographers, looking at how these rules for different redistricting processes would shake out around the country. And what they found is that actually about 20% of the districts in Missouri with voter approved rules will be competitive. The rest will be safer, either for more Republican, more Democratic. And all of this can be done without having crazy shaped districts. So I think it is a fundamental misunderstanding of the policy to suggest that every district would match the statewide vote total. I'd also say Missouri isn't exactly a 50-50 district right now either. And so that's one of the things with the voter approved rules, is that it looks at how voters vote over a few different cycles, over a few different races. And then it says the overall outcome has to be fair from a partisan point of view.
Tina Goodrich, would you like to respond to any of the last two things I've talked with Sean Nicholson about?
So first of all, with the Clean Missouri, which was Amendment 1, the whole point of that amendment was to make sure they were gerrymandering the districts so that they could get 50-50 in every single district. That was the whole point. The reason why they put so many things in that was to confuse the voters, and it worked. I was working with the GOP, going door to door, talking to the voters, and they had no clue what was in that. So when they voted for it, they didn't have a clue what they were voting for. And now we are laying it out there and making it clear to the public exactly what we want to do. We're not trying to hide anything the way he has stated. And trying to keep everything 50-50, there's no way you can have my district 50-50 without gerrymandering it. There's just no way.
When you say voters did not know what they voted for in 2018, I've already received some, and you probably saw this also, somebody said, I thought we decided this in 2018. I think it was clear that there was going to be the use of a demographer, because the coverage, if anybody was paying attention, they would have known that the system was going to change to a demographer. So I think that there is some resistance to those who would say, well, you didn't know what you were doing 2 years ago. We're going to make it simple for you and correct your mistake, voters.
Many people thought that they were voting to make things environmentally friendly or clean up the streets or whatever. I mean, seriously, they were confused.
Sean, would you like to respond to that? Did we not know what we were voting for Clean Missouri in 2018?
So the Clean Missouri Amendment was put on the ballot after 340,000 signatures were collected and after a 2-year campaign of talking about everything that was in the fine print. The very first bullet on every single petition, the very first bullet on all of the 1.4 million ballots that were cast for Amendment 3 or Amendment 1 back in 2018 said that this is about changing the redistricting process. It was literally the first bullet. It was the thing we talked about most in every press interview, every radio interview. So I don't know what to say other than you can look at the ballot language and every petition and everyone can see exactly what was going on.
I went to many thousands and thousands of doors. I knocked on their doors, talked person to person to these people, and there was almost nobody that knew about it. Nobody. If I hadn't told them, they wouldn't have known a thing.
Chris Kelly, who was our presenter for Amendment 1, he's put on chat, and I think you've been able to see this. How decisive was Baker v. Carr, the Supreme Court decision on who to count when redistricting? I've read some of this also, and I know at least some articles several months ago were raising questions about whether that would apply in this case or not. Any thought on that, Tina Goodrich?
I'm sorry, repeat.
Well, there's some conversation that the Supreme Court has already decided that who you should count when deciding how many people live within a certain district, that the Supreme Court already decided that, and that this is already determined by law and the Constitution.
Yes, I mean, you're supposed to have voters decide. So why are we deciding, including babies?
Some would say also that when a 10-year period, within a 10-year period where redistricting would happen again, that everybody who was 8 would become of voting age at the end of that, and all the years 8 to 18 throughout that 10 years would become voters, and they would be ignored. Sean, I'll come back to you. Any comment about what has already been decided legally?
Yeah, so the rules are a little bit different in terms of what the federal Constitution says about who counts in congressional maps. Again, this is about changing how state legislative maps are drawn. The Attorney General's office, the sponsor of Amendment 3, the speaker tonight have all been very clear that they very much intend for maps to be drawn if Amendment 3 passes based on the number of eligible voters in the state. And so that means kids don't count. So to your point, David, there's 2 little boys upstairs that I can hear yelling as they get ready for bath time. One is 9 and one is 11. And they will not be eligible voters when maps are drawn next year, but they will very much vote in the state House and state Senate districts because those last for a full 10 years. That is fundamentally wrong. There is a reason that no other state in the United States does this. There's a reason that Missouri has counted everyone for 145 years. And the whole point of this is to tinker with the rules, tinker under the hood, so that the outcome can be letting lobbyists and political operatives draw maps to protect their friends.
Sean, you said on your slide presentation a moment ago, you had a point up, and I wrote this down. It said something about carved up communities. Now, I've read the pages of this particular amendment, and I know it's summarized, but in the pages, it's talking about how the newly drawn lines would be squares, rectangles, some other, and as our pro amendment number 3 person said a moment ago, Tina Goodrich, that is what they're trying to avoid, because I think it even says in the amendment details that they would try to not divide up counties and for sure not divide up cities. So how are communities carved up?
Yeah, so the language that's just moved around. The language is in the law. The law right now is that districts have to be compact and contiguous. So that is already the law. The question is, if that the only thing that matters, fairness, other kinds of things don't matter. Amendment 3 wants to use compactness as a loophole to let other stuff happen. On the specific point of communities getting carved up, there's a new formula, an arbitrary formula that would be added in Amendment 3 on population deviation. So happy to get into the nitty gritty, but on the population deviation, they want to set a lower threshold for how much variance you can have between the population of different districts. And the net effect of that, by setting such a tight statistical constraint, is that neighborhoods, blocks, apartment buildings would all have to get carved up to hit these arbitrary population standards. The case law, how it's happened in Missouri, how it's happened around the country, shows that a little bit of flexibility is really important, because that allows you to achieve other goals like keeping towns and neighborhoods together. If you add an extra 20 people because that allows an entire block to be together, that can be a good outcome. So it's the population deviation formula change that can have some really bad outcomes if you really have to ratchet down the math.
I think Tina Goodrich said a little while ago when she was talking about St. Joseph and how if you drew a district line that dipped down into Kansas City to even things out with more of a fairness, is it true that some in the Democratic Black Caucus in the St. Louis area have spoken out no or yes on Amendment 3 because they're afraid of diluted representation also? What would you say about those who are concerned about, well, this might be good in some areas because it may help even out in some areas, but we might lose some representatives because of how we would be drawn in a metropolitan area?
Yeah, so we've been hearing misinformation about that every district has to be 50-50 for a while. That is not the law now. It's impossible. It's illegal to do that. I outlined some of those reasons before, but I think as it relates to protections for voters of color, the very first rule in the Constitution now says that the voting power of communities of color cannot be abridged either intentionally or unintentionally. Civil rights leaders, legal groups, activists from across Missouri and across the nation have praised the language that voters approved in 2018 because it puts Missouri in the top tier of states with legal protections for those communities of color. What Amendment 3 tries to do is to roll back that standard objectively while also changing who counts. And so that's why you have groups like the NAACP, faith groups, other civil rights groups like the Brennan Center for Justice, activists like Action St. Louis or Missouri Faith Voices or Missouri Jobs for Justice, all coming together to fight Amendment 3 and being rather specific about the discriminatory impact of what would happen if Amendment 3 passed.
Tina Goodrich, I'll welcome you back for any comments on the last question that I asked Sean Nicholson or maybe the previous one. Your thoughts on this issue?
I've seen areas of Kansas City. I've gone door to door in Kansas City, and it's the areas where I was majority Democrat areas. If you're going to make that 50-50, you're going to have to draw little pieces of that in with the rural areas. And so you're sitting here saying that the people of color are going to they're going to be represented better without Amendment 3 when it's totally the opposite. Nobody will be represented by the people they should be represented by, because I might be represented by someone in Kansas City in the middle of the city, whereas the people of color in Kansas City may be represented by someone like me up here.
What is your understanding, and we can see this as one of the participants in the chat says that you might be missing the point on the 50-50 issue. What is the, because I don't think that's the race issue, the 50-50 issue. How is that interpreted?
No, 50-50 means it has to be 50% Democrat, 50% Republican. And in order to make that, you have to get the it's the big cities like Kansas City, St. Louis, Columbia, Springfield that have more Democrats in there. So, and the rural areas and smaller towns tend to be more Republican. So in order to get that 50% Republican, 50% Democrat, you're going to have to take those big city portions and gerrymander that all around to get enough Republicans into that district to make it 50-50.
Sean, I would welcome you back here. And again, the 50-50, is that a competitiveness statewide, trying to look at all of the districts that have state representatives, trying to even those up so that the districts total would be perhaps closer to 50-50 Democrat, Republican when the 100+ representatives meet in Jefferson City, or is it each individual district?
So there are 163 House districts. There are 34 state Senate districts. The rules that are in the Constitution now say that the overall plan cannot be unfair to either party, to voters of either party. And it looks at how voters vote over 3 different election cycles for 3 statewide offices. So how voters vote for president, Senate, and governor. The fairness rules apply to the overall plan. There is no prescription as Tina has described. It is a made up thing. It does not exist. What she is saying is violates the law. What she is saying is going to happen is against the law. It's impossible to do with how Missourians live, how Missourians vote. I will put in the chat again for everyone to go read for yourself. Independent experts who have nothing to do with the Missouri policy have looked at how the math works out. And they have found that about 20% of the seats, not 100% of the seats, would be in the competitive range. So not even exactly 50-50, but like close-ish to that. The rest would favor one party because people sometimes self-segregate. I happen to live in Kansas City now. I grew up in Palmyra. Palmyra votes for Republicans. It's going to keep voting for Republicans. You're not going to find a district that is super competitive in Marion County. You're not going to find a district that's super competitive in South Kansas City. So I would just say, like, I don't know how to say it another way. Like, this is just not a thing. That's not what the law is. There is a reason that every anti-gerrymandering, every redistricting reform organization endorsed the Clean Missouri Amendment in 2018, and every one of them say that Amendment 3 is bad for democracy, it's bad for Missouri, and voters should vote no on Amendment 3.
I'm going to have to wrap this up in a moment, and I'll get a final comment from Tina Goodrick also. But before we end this, I want to go back to something that that she said early, and then also that one of our chat participants wanted clarification. The point was made that one person, the state auditor, is choosing a demographer. Now that state auditor is looking at applications to be a demographer. What is the process after the state auditor says these people have applied? How many does the state auditor, she in this case, or he in the future, turns into to whom, and how then is that demographer hired? Sean, I'll come to you for that.
Yeah, so the state auditor collects applications and turns them over to the Senate. And that's where we're at in the process right now. There are 6 applications that are sitting with the state Senate. The Democratic leader and the Republican leader could agree on a nominee, and then that person becomes the demographer. That's the end of the process. If they don't agree on the best applicant, both the Democratic leader and the Republican leader can take names off the list. They can take up to a third of the names off the list. And if there are still people left over at the end of the day, the auditor conducts a lottery, but that is the auditor's sum total of the roll. So right now, the applications are sitting in the Senate. The Senate has chosen not to act on them. The Senate could pick the demographer today if they wanted to. They haven't yet. And I imagine once Amendment 3 is rejected, things will start to move pretty quickly because the census will be over and it'll be time for redistricting to happen in 2021.
Sean Nicholson, thank you. I want to go back to Tina Goodrick. He's kind of made his final statement, and so I'm curious as to how you would like to summarize your position on this tonight.
Well, we had the Amendment 1 before, and the whole reason why it got on was because of George Soros, union thugs, and big PACs. So that's the whole reason. The Republican Party didn't have enough money to fight it. That's the reason why it got on. Now we're trying to fix that and make sure everything's done fairly. State auditor should not be the one that makes the final choice on how things are redistricted, and she will be when she gets that gets to pick the demographer. I still believe that without Amendment 3, our rural Northwest Missouri could be drawn into districts of Kansas City, and it would protect our representation here and also protect representation in Kansas City with the minority districts as well. So it's good for everybody. A vote for yes on 3 is a vote for everyone.
Tina Goodrich, thank you. As you said earlier, this was kind of a last minute. You're filling in for another guest that was going to be here to present the pro side of Amendment 3. So it was a last minute fill in. So thank you very much. I appreciate your time this evening.
Thank you.
And then Sean Nicholson, who represents Clean Missouri. Thank you so much, Sean, for what you brought to the discussion tonight. Appreciate your time. I would say again, Amendment 3, you'll see that is presented on the language as ban gifts from paid lobbyists to legislators. That was a part of Amendment 1 2 years ago when we voted on that. It just restricts that down to 0 in most cases. Reduce legislative campaign contribution limits. That's for state Senate. Right now, we could give $2,500, it would reduce it to $2,400. And I think as this discussion has shown, most of the question about this, whether you're going to vote for it or against it, quite possibly should be around the modifying and reordering of the redistricting criteria, as it says on the ballot. So I hope people are educated by what happened tonight. I know that I have learned some things. Amendment 1, the presentation there from Chris Kelly, we appreciate his time. And I really do appreciate all of those who have participated and sent in chat comments and questions. Also, I appreciate the League of Women Voters for allowing me the opportunity. You know, when a couple of other people say that they can't do it, unlike Tina Goodrich, I get chosen to fill in also, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to do that. And also for the Daniel Boone Regional Library and Columbia Public Library, for Lauren Williams for making sure that we all get on the air. Again, don't forget that there are other forums that are coming up. The next one will be October the 6th, which is next week, probably, I think on Tuesday. That'll feature state representatives. October 13th, another Tuesday away, that would be the Boone County Commissioners. And then on October 14th, the sheriff and the circuit judge. So you'll have opportunities to participate the way you did tonight on those 3 upcoming forums presented by the League of Women Voters, who do a such good job of educating us and giving us the opportunity to know what we're voting on when you either cast an absentee or a mail-in between now and then on November the 3rd. So thank you all so much. I hope that you have a good evening, and we will see you again somewhere in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.